This was the sound of a Gemini Titan rocket lifting off from its pad at Cape Kennedy. It was probably the most dramatic sound of 1965. But there was another sound, less compelling, but possibly even more significant.
It was the sound of water being wasted. A dripping faucet can be annoying, especially in the middle of the night, but what used to be a minor irritation was seen in 1965 as a major disaster. There simply wasn't enough water.
By the late 1970s, our requirements for fresh water will overtake our supply. At the present time, we use about 355 billion gallons of water per day. The technically available supply, that is available in the sense that it's where you need it, when you need it, is about 550 billion gallons of water per day. By 1980, the demand will exceed that supply, and by the year 2000, only 35 years away, we will need over 1,000 billion gallons of water per day, and the supply will be the same.
The villains were the westerlies, those high-altitude winds that blow roughly from southwest to northeast and bring rain to the heartlands, to Kansas and Missouri and Michigan and the rocky little farms of New England. In 1961, these westerlies began to shift subtly to the north. The movement continued until, by 1965, they were about 500 miles off course, and there was a parched area that stretched from Maryland to Maine. Government engineers drew up plans for pumping water from one place to another, but it was clear that these were stopgap measures. There simply wasn't enough water, and if all the leaking faucets in the country were repaired, there still wouldn't be enough.
On Saturday, September 4th, Hurricane Betsy, newly born and vicious, moved to within 360 miles of Cape Kennedy. Indications were it would go north and lose itself in the North Atlantic. Indications were wrong. The next day, it headed south and hit Nassau. Miami was next, and then New Orleans. When Betsy finally drifted away and quietly expired, she left behind 100 dead and $1 billion damage. The Weather Bureau, in an uncharacteristic and somewhat sentimental gesture, announced it would retire the name Betsy for 10 years. This, they said, was because of her infamy. There were more books that year with more four-letter words than ever before, but a lot of people were buying books with polysyllabic words. Samuel Eliot Morrison's The Oxford History of the American People was important and probably memorable, and a number of writers, of course, were concerned, as always, with the South and the Civil War, toiling, as somebody said, in the fields of Catton. Bruce Catton, by the way, made his contribution with Never Call Retreat.
Today, the world is facing a population crisis.
I'm opposed to violence! I'm opposed to...
Out here in Washington, we look forward with great pleasure to meeting...
Delivers 2-2 to Bob Allison. Swung on and missed. Allison is out, and Koufax strikes out number 10.
Jamais plus les uns contre les autres. Jamais, plus jamais.
Frank, it looks like it comes out at the separation plane. It might be the fiberglass. Approximately.
And then, on the clear moonlit evening of November 9th, just after nightfall, the impossible happened.
Virtually all of New York City was blacked out at 5:28 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight by a power failure. Reports indicated that parts of Westchester and eastern New York State were also affected.
New York, Albany, New York, Binghamton, New York, and from Providence, Rhode Island. All of New York State appeared to be out of power. Robert Jenna, the president of the...
report in New York City, the Transit Authority says as many as 150,000 persons might be stranded in the city's subways.
It was as though suddenly the 20th century had been repealed.
Planes in the air were unable to land, and those on the ground were unable to take off.
There were farmers who, for the first time in their lives, milked a cow by hand. Kerosene lamps lost their quaintness and were put back to work.
States where the lights went off included New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Connecticut,
thousands of commuters were
on New York's Park Avenue, hostesses in Dior dresses cooked dinner in the fireplace.
Motionless without electric power. in the stations and in Times Square.
Television sets blinked off, and news-hungry adults took the transistor radios away from teenagers whose rock and roll music had been replaced by blackout bulletins.
Maybe one just south of Niagara in upstate New York. There was a sudden, instantaneous power cutoff, or possibly a power surge.
For the record, the trouble was caused by a relay in a Canadian power plant 4 miles north of Niagara Falls.
Other events in other lands made their marks on 1965's history. The Communist Chinese exploded their second atomic bomb and bragged about it. Fidel Castro, for reasons not clear, relaxed his ban and allowed Cubans who wished to migrate to the United States. The very young and the very old had priority. Draft-age males were not included.
In the Atlantic Ocean on November 13th, the cruise ship Yarmouth Castle caught fire and sank with a loss of 89 lives. On December 19th, Charles de Gaulle won a runoff election to a second 7-year term as President of France, but only when he abandoned his aloof austerity and took to television after his failure to gain an absolute majority in the earlier presidential elections.
India and Pakistan fought an ugly little war in the north. On November 11th, a white minority government of Britain's African colony, Rhodesia, in a document that sounded like the American Declaration of Independence, proclaimed itself an independent nation. Expectedly, in these times, the issue was racial. And on April 24th, violence came to the Dominican Republic.
Six and 7 Hawaii will be standing by if you have anything for us. Roger. There seems to be a lot of traffic up here, that's all. All the policemen.
The date was December 15th, and 4 United States astronauts, hurtling at 17,500 miles an hour above the Earth, were pulling off the most exciting American achievement of the space race.
It might be the fiberglass that's approximately 10 to 15 feet long.
The separation plane for the booster, right?
Affirmative.
That's exactly where you have one, too. It really belted around there when you were firing your thrusters.
Command pilot Walter Schirra of Gemini 6 talks with the crewmen of sister ship Gemini 7 and ground controls as they accomplish the first rendezvous in space.
We can see the two Gemini stars casting bonds off to the right of Gemini 6. The correction is 7. They're all in a line. Roger.
Ask them what their range is now.
6, what's your range? 20 feet. Roger. 20 feet, mate. We did it.
We did it. Later, safely down after a textbook Atlantic landing, Schirra calmly explained how he did it.
The first time we saw spacecraft 7 was at 54 miles slant range. This is when we started doing our work. And from there on, it was a case of maintaining very small rates as we closed, till finally we were, as Tom was quoted at least saying, at 120 feet sitting. His statement really was 120 feet steady. And this was our real proud moment. 7 was leading us in orbit in the attitude we call BEF, which is blunt end forward, and we were in the attitude of SEF, or small end forward. And this is the nose-to-nose routine, and as a result of this, we've got our complete confidence up and did close to about 1 foot in this position.
Now, that was the end of our busiest year in space. Pictures transmitted back across the 140 million miles between us and Mars. They showed a very thin atmosphere on the planet, but the old argument about the possibility of life on Mars was undiminished.
Jimmy 4, Houston, Cap Cobb.
Hey, Gus, I don't know if you're ready, but we're right over Houston.
On June 3rd, Gemini 4 went into orbit.
Jimmy 4?
Aboard were Major James A. McDivitt and Major Edward H. White. And on this flight, for the first time, an American, Major White, stepped out and floated in space. It took years and millions of dollars to put a man alone in space, and as it turned out, it was almost as hard to get him back.
Gemini 4, Houston.
Is that right? Well, I've taken a lot, but they're not very good. You're in too close for most of them. I finally put the focus down to about 8 feet or so.
Gemini 4, Houston.
See what
flight director's got to say?
What did he say?
The flight director says get back in. This is Jim. Got any message for us? Jimmy Ford, get back in. Okay. I don't know. We're coming over the west end. They want you to come back in now. Roger. We've been trying to talk to you for a while here. No, back in. Come on. You can almost not back in, but I'm coming. We still got 3.5 more days to go, buddy. I'm coming. Okay.
Gemini 3, 4, and 5, like clockwork, 60 days apart. Then 7 and 6 in a dual flight, all manned, all successful. For the first time since October 1957 and the first Soviet Sputnik, the United States had reason to feel it was at least in the same space league with the Russians, and perhaps well in the lead. To listen to the voices of the astronauts was almost like listening to the future. Almost, for even in space, some vestiges of the past survive.
Gemini 7, this is Gemini 6. We have an object, looks like a satellite, going from north to south, probably in a polar orbit. He's in a very low trajectory, traveling from north to south, and has a very high fineness ratio.
A playful Wally Schirra, the rendezvous now a page in history, radios that he's in contact with a mysterious flying object near his Gemini 6 in the cold December skies.
Is a new world coming? We welcome it.
Is our world gone? The answer, of course, must be yes. Old values challenged, old truths held up to the light and examined for weakness. Young people saying things that we never said and doing things that we never did. And, as always in such times, the guidepost to the future was in the past. It is part of our glory that those who have left us leave their wisdom behind for all who must walk the new roads.
Nothing is final. Change is unceasing, and it is very likely that mankind has a lot more to learn before they come to their journey's end. We might even find ourselves in a few years moving along a broad, smooth causeway of peace and plenty, instead of roaming and peering round along the rim of hell.